Good morning. This is Dr. Bryson, and this is a video on labeling theory for the criminology class at Glenville State University in the fall of 2022. With labeling theory, we need to understand that there is a sense in which social constructionism is a part of this, because social constructionism, or what we call social constructionism, is assumed in the concept of symbolic interactionism. Symbolic interactionism basically asserts that we create meaning through our interactions with others. So that not only refers to meanings of words, but meanings of events. So we create this kind of shared meaning through our interactions with others of these symbols. So symbolic interactionism, it's very important to understand that symbolic interactionism is the subjective creating of meaning through interaction. Now, with this, we have our looking glass self. So as we interact with others, we look in the mirror and we determine who we are. We define ourselves through this symbolic interactionism with others. So we ourselves are one of the phenomenon that we are defining. Now, hopefully, most of you know the Michael Jackson song, Man in the Mirror. I'm looking at the man in the mirror. I'm asking him to change his ways. Two of the lines of the song. The purpose or the point of the song is to get across the message that if I'm going to change the world, I've got to change myself. If I'm going to change something in the culture, I have to change myself first. Well, that kind of goes along with this looking glass self, but remember, the looking glass self is how we define ourselves in relationship to others. We are always redefining ourselves through our symbolic interactions with other people. Now, with those symbolic interactions, as I define myself, I then begin to act as though my definition were true. And if I'm acting as though my definition were true, then I am engaging in what's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. In other words, whether my definition is true or not, I'm going to make it true by the choices that I make. Now, this is not a conscious effort. The person doesn't say, I believe this to be true about myself, so I'm consciously going to go make it happen. This is quite subconscious. So try to remember that we are working with a theory that espouses determinism, not free will. Okay, very important. Now, with this self-fulfilling prophecy, we also need to understand primary deviance versus secondary deviance. Now, primary deviance is violating the norms, the standards, the folkways, the pathways of the culture, but in a way where the person is not shamed or labeled as a deviant. In other words, these are things that might be minor or they might be major, such as white-collar crime, cheating a whole bunch of people, but in a legal way out of their money. Okay, that person may not be labeled a deviant, even though they've harmed other people. Okay. Secondary deviance is when the individual is brought to the attention of the culture and shamed by the culture. Now, what we really need to say is that with labeling theory, okay, so let's get back up to the symbolic interactionism. With labeling theory, someone gets caught with something, and now we address that as though they were a deviant. And it might have been a minor thing. It might have been what would fall under primary deviance, but we address it publicly. So that person is now in a situation where through the symbolic interactionism, they're seen as delinquent or deviant in some way, even if it's mild deviance from the norm, from the cultural norm. It's still deviance. So now that person begins to look at themselves in the mirror, the proverbial mirror, not the literal mirror, okay? They begin to look at themselves in the mirror and they start to redefine themselves as that person that the culture has defined them as. And from that, they now begin to engage in secondary deviant acts in a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, well, they think I'm bad. Gee, I must be bad, so I go do bad things. The heart of labeling theory is that juvenile delinquency occurs when a person is labeled bad for a minor thing. And because of being labeled bad for a minor thing, they might be then placed in a program with more serious delinquent offenders, or they may not, but they begin to label themselves in this way. So I'm going to tell you about my youth ministry professor, Dr. Shrigley, from grad school. Now, I had him for this course in the fall of 1987. That's 35 years ago, okay? Just so you know. But Dr. Shrigley was an adjunct professor at the grad school, at the seminary that I attended. He was actually a Bible teacher at a local Christian high school, private school. And this was a very large school, actually, in Memphis, Tennessee. He had this one kid in his class, and just for the sake of clarity, we'll say his name was John. Now, John, so we'll call him John Smith. So John Smith was a horrible kid. He was the bad seed. He was always doing bad things. In every class, he was the class clown. He was disruptive. He bullied. He never learned anything. He never participated. All he did was disrupt the class. So that was John Smith. Well, now, Dr. Shrigley also had another student, John Adams. Now, John Adams was the best student that he had. Well, Dr. Shrigley said that he was in the habit of writing notes home to all of his students' parents and sending them home on Fridays, and he would just send notes updating them on every one of his students. So most of them were very positive notes, but there were a few that were not so positive. And for John Smith and John Adams, one day he accidentally put their notes in the wrong envelope. And he never put last names on the notes inside. On the envelopes he did, but on the notes inside, he just said, your son John. He didn't say your son John Adams or John Smith. So John Smith gets John Adams' note. Now, remember, John Adams' note was a very praising note. But John Smith's parents get that note. Monday morning, first thing, John Smith tracks down Dr. Shrigley. And he says, Dr. Shrigley, I didn't know that you felt that way about me. I didn't know that you could see anything good in me. And from that point forward, John Smith ceased to cause problems in Dr. Shrigley's class. Never had another problem out of him. Made an A in his class. Now, in all the other classes, John still kind of caused problems. And wasn't as severe, if I remember the story, but he still didn't perform as well on the other classes. What happened is that in Dr. Shrigley's class, John Smith was able to see himself in this looking glass the proverbial looking glass in a very different way. So he became a very different person through this self-fulfilling prophecy that he'd been given by Dr. Shrigley inadvertently. I always add this part to the story because we had to ask Dr. Shrigley ourselves as well. What about John Adams and his parents? They got the bad note. What happened? And Dr. Shrigley said that when he realized his error after John Smith had approached him, he made a very frantic and quick phone call to the parents of John Adams to clarify what had happened and asked them not to pass this along. He then apologized to John Adams and said that John Adams' note was the template he was working off of for some of the other students, and he had just accidentally put the template into the envelope. So he told a little white lie, from my understanding, to smooth things over. But it worked. He didn't mean to do it at all, but it worked. See, that's labeling theory. John Smith now was able to see a different looking glass self because someone showed him a different looking glass self by accident, but they still did. So this is where the film The Breakfast Club comes into play. And I want you to look at the videos on The Breakfast Club that I post in the classroom. You need to watch those because The Breakfast Club, the John Hughes film, is a very strong example of labeling theory. In fact, the letter or the essay that the brain writes for the whole group in the end is really an example of labeling theory. So these kids in Saturday school, which is a form of detention back in the 80s, I don't know if they still do it, but back in the 80s, they did Saturday school as a form of detention. So these kids in Saturday school are told, you're not going to study while you're here. You're not going to do anything except write an essay telling me who you think you are, that you did what you did to get yourself in here. So the film shows all of these different kids from all these different cliques. You've got the rich girl, you've got the jock, you've got the criminal, you've got the brain, and then you've got the weird girl. So all of these folks are in this Saturday school, and as they are left to their own devices and they start to talk, they stop hating each other. And in the end, as the vice principal is reading the essay, they all say, we don't understand why you ask us to write this essay because you see us the way you want to see us, as a jock, as a princess, as a criminal, as the weird girl, as a brain. You simply see us the way you want to. And so they've lived up to this for all these years. And then they kind of realize they don't have to live up to the labels of other people. That's labeling theory. That is labeling theory. Very important to recognize this. So I'm going to throw this out, and I want you to think about this. The high school where you attended. Do you remember anyone that got labeled a particular way and they could never live down that label? It might actually be you. You might be the one to have been labeled and not be able to live down that label. Interesting thing, there are a lot of labels we give to folks, not just a single one per person, but when I was in high school, I was labeled the photographer, but I was also, which I had forgotten, known as the Beatles freak. I love the Beatles. I grew up as a child hearing the Beatles on the radio, and I mean from birth, because the Beatles arrived in the U.S. the same year within just a couple of months of my birth. So as a child, the Beatles would be playing on the radio, and I would hear them as a child. So I ended up loving the Beatles. Well, I went to my 40-year high school reunion about 6 weeks ago, and somebody actually said, "Why did you love the Beatles so much when you were in high school?" They still held on to that label that I'm a Beatles freak. So they gave me this label. They gave me this label. And even 40 years later, some people are still remembering it. I'd forgotten it, but there were some that still remembered it. But think about yourself in high school. Were you labeled as something? And you had to live up to that label. Now, in the movie The Breakfast Club, we find out that even the brainiac and the jock and the princess have a lot of pressure to live up to the label that has been placed on them. So just think about that, and we'll see you next video.